Platform 7 at Union Station was packed with the usual evening rush of commuters, desperate to catch the 6:15 to Baltimore. But what was about to unfold in the next 8 minutes would expose a truth that law enforcement agencies across America have been quietly trying to ignore for decades. When Sergeant Daniela Chen, a 12-year veteran of the Maryland State Police with commendations for bravery and 2 decorated citations for community service, approached the ticket checkpoint in her civilian clothes carrying nothing but a backpack and her badge. 3 state troopers didn't see a colleague, didn't see a sister in blue, didn't see 12 years of exemplary service. They saw something else entirely, and what they did next would not only shock the hundreds of witnesses standing on that platform, but would trigger an internal affairs investigation that would reveal a pattern so disturbing that it would make national headlines within 72 hours. Because standing just 20 feet away pretending to check his phone was Lieutenant Marcus Webb, a white supervisor from her own department who had been conducting an undercover discrimination audit after months of complaints from female officers and officers of color, and what he was about to witness would force him to question everything he thought he knew about the department he'd served for 18 years. Baltimore's Penn Station, 6:40 p.m. on a Thursday evening in late October. Sergeant Daniela Chen had just finished testifying in a federal trafficking case that had taken 3 years to build. A case where her undercover work and fluency in Mandarin had been instrumental in rescuing 17 victims and dismantling a criminal network that stretched from San Francisco to the East Coast. And now she was finally heading home, exhausted but satisfied, looking forward to seeing her 8-year-old daughter's soccer game the next morning and maybe, just maybe, getting a full night's sleep for the first time in 2 weeks. Daniela had chosen to travel in plain clothes, dark jeans, a leather jacket, comfortable boots, her straight black hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, her Korean-American features showing the fatigue of someone who'd spent the last 48 hours in courtrooms and deposition rooms. She carried her service weapon, concealed in a shoulder holster as regulations required, her badge and credentials tucked securely in her jacket pocket, and a simple backpack containing a change of clothes and case files that she'd need to review over the weekend. What Daniela didn't know was that her decision to take the train instead of driving, her choice to dress down after a grueling court appearance, her very existence as an Asian American woman in law enforcement, would make her a target of the very colleagues who were supposed to have her back. And standing near the coffee kiosk watching everything through the reflection in his phone screen was Lieutenant Marcus Webb, 43 years old, 20-year law enforcement veteran, someone who had mentored Daniela early in her career and had recently been tapped by the department's Internal Affairs Division to conduct covert observations after a disturbing pattern of complaints had emerged. Female officers and officers of color reporting being stopped, questioned, and subjected to excessive scrutiny by their own colleagues when off-duty or in civilian clothes, complaints that had been quietly filed away and ignored, until the numbers became impossible to dismiss, and a civil rights attorney started asking uncomfortable questions that the department could no longer deflect. Daniela approached the platform entrance where 3 Maryland state troopers had set up what they called a random security checkpoint. Trooper Derek Paulson, a 6'2" white man in his early 30s with the kind of aggressive swagger that suggested he watched too many cop movies and believed his own mythology, flanked by Trooper Amanda Reese, a blonde woman who seemed perpetually uncomfortable with her partner's behavior but lacked the courage to challenge it, and Trooper Kevin Mills, a younger black man who'd only been on the force for 18 months and was still trying to figure out how to navigate the complicated politics of proving himself while not betraying his own community. Daniela showed her ticket to the attendant and moved toward the platform, but Paulson stepped directly into her path, his hand raised in that universal gesture of authority that cops use when they want to assert dominance. "Excuse me, Miss, we're conducting random security checks. I'm going to need you to stop and answer some questions." Daniela, tired but professional, stopped and responded calmly, "Of course, officer, what do you need?" But something in her tone, that subtle edge of someone who knows the law, who understands procedure, who isn't intimidated by the uniform, seemed to irritate Paulson immediately, and you could see it in the way his jaw tightened, the way his eyes narrowed as they swept over her appearance, cataloging and judging. Asian woman, traveling alone, backpack, no visible nervousness but also no visible deference, and in Paulson's mental calculation that apparently added up to suspicious. "What's in the backpack?" he demanded, not asked, demanded, and Daniela, maintaining her professional composure despite the exhaustion pulling at her bones and the irritation starting to simmer in her chest, replied, "Personal belongings and work documents. I'm a law enforcement officer heading home from court testimony." She reached slowly toward her jacket pocket to retrieve her credentials, telegraphing her movements the way every cop is trained to do. But Paulson's hand immediately went to his weapon. "Don't reach for anything. Keep your hands where I can see them, ma'am. Step back from the entrance." And suddenly the atmosphere shifted from routine interaction to potential confrontation, and other travelers on the platform started to notice, started to slow down, started to pull out phones, because everyone in America in 2024 knows that when police start treating someone like a threat, you document it, you record it, because sometimes that footage is the only thing standing between truth and a carefully constructed official narrative. The crowd on platform 7 became a living study in human behavior under pressure. Some people immediately moved away, creating distance between themselves and whatever was unfolding, performing that instinctive self-preservation that says, "This isn't my problem, I don't want to get involved, I just need to catch my train." An elderly white woman clutched her purse tighter and whispered something to her husband, their body language suggesting they'd already decided Daniela was dangerous based on nothing more than the troopers' treatment of her. Because we're conditioned to trust uniforms, to assume that if police are suspicious, then their suspicion must be warranted, that if someone is being detained, they must have done something to deserve it. But a young black mother holding her toddler's hand caught Daniela's eye, and there was recognition there. That knowing look that passes between people who've experienced being presumed guilty, being treated as threats in spaces where they have every right to exist. And she pulled out her phone and started recording, not saying anything but bearing witness, making sure that whatever happened next would have documentation beyond whatever story the troopers decided to tell. A Latino teenager in a varsity jacket whispered to his friend, "Yo, that's messed up." She told them she's a cop, showing that generational divide where young people recognize injustice more readily than their elders sometimes can or will. Trooper Reese looked increasingly uncomfortable, shifting her weight from foot to foot, occasionally glancing at Paulson as if wanting to say something but unable or unwilling to challenge her senior partner, performing that complicity through silence that allows bad actors to thrive in systems that should be holding them accountable. Trooper Mills stood slightly behind, his face carefully neutral but his eyes showing conflict, and you could almost see the internal calculation happening. Speak up and risk being labeled a troublemaker. Stay silent and be complicit in something his conscience was screaming was wrong. And 20 feet away, Lieutenant Marcus Webb was recording everything on his phone, documenting not just the interaction with Daniela, but the crowd's reactions, the other troopers' body language, building a case file in real time that would later become evidence in disciplinary hearings and policy reform meetings and uncomfortable conversations about the culture of modern American policing. Paulson, sensing an audience and feeling the need to justify his actions with increasingly aggressive authority, raised his voice loud enough for the entire platform to hear, "Ma'am, I'm not going to ask you again. Put the backpack down and keep your hands visible. You're acting suspicious and I have reasonable cause to detain you." And Daniela, drawing on every ounce of professional training and personal restraint, responded with that dangerous calm that every person of color develops as a survival mechanism. "Officer, I am Sergeant Daniela Chen, Maryland State Police, badge number 2847. I am carrying my service weapon concealed as per departmental regulations, and my credentials are in my left jacket pocket. I am going to slowly retrieve them now to verify my identity. I am not reaching for my weapon. I am reaching for my badge." But Paulson either didn't hear or didn't care, or saw this as some kind of challenge to his authority that needed to be crushed. because he actually grabbed Daniela's arm as she moved toward her pocket, spinning her around and pushing her against the nearest pillar while barking, "I said, don't move. You're being detained for suspicious behavior." And failure to comply with lawful orders, and the gasps from the crowd were audible. Multiple phones were now recording. Trooper Reese finally found her voice to say, "Derek, maybe we should let her show her." But Paulson cut her off. "I'm handling this, Reese. Call for backup. We've got a potential 10-10 with a subject claiming to be law enforcement, using radio codes as if Daniela was some kind of armed threat requiring tactical response rather than a colleague who'd simply tried to catch a train after a long day at work." The irony was devastating. Here was a woman who'd dedicated 12 years to protecting the public, who'd literally testified against human traffickers that very day, who'd put her life on the line repeatedly in service of justice, being treated like a criminal by someone wearing the same oath, serving the same supposed mission, and all because Paulson couldn't or wouldn't see past his preconceptions about what a sergeant should look like, couldn't reconcile his narrow mental image of authority with the reality of a 5'6" Asian American woman who had more courage, more skill, more integrity in her smallest finger than he'd demonstrated in his entire career. And his arrogance was about to collide with reality, in a way, that would end his career and spark reforms he couldn't have imagined. That's when Lieutenant Marcus Webb decided the audit had collected enough evidence and it was time to intervene, because what had started as documentation of potential bias had escalated into an active violation of a fellow officer's rights, into a public humiliation that could traumatize a decorated sergeant, into exactly the kind of incident that destroys careers and departments and public trust in ways that take generations to rebuild. Webb pocketed his phone, straightened his jacket to reveal the lieutenant's badge clipped to his belt, and walked directly through the crowd with the kind of command presence that makes people instinctively clear a path. And when he reached the checkpoint, his voice carried across the platform with crystal clarity. "Trooper Paulson, this is Lieutenant Marcus Webb, Internal Affairs Division. You are currently detaining Sergeant Daniela Chen from the Criminal Investigation Unit, and this entire interaction has been recorded as part of an official departmental audit. I need you to release Sergeant Chen immediately and step back from the situation before you add insubordination and assault of a superior officer to the disciplinary charges you're already facing." The effect was instantaneous and almost comical if it weren't so serious. Paulson's face went through an entire spectrum of emotions. In about 3 seconds, from aggressive confidence to confusion to recognition to absolute horror as the implications crashed over him like a tsunami of career-ending consequences, his grip on Daniela's arm releasing as if she'd suddenly become electrified, his body language shifting from aggressive authority to defensive panic, stumbling backward and stammering, "I didn't know. She didn't identify herself properly. I was just following protocol." But Webb cut through his excuses like a knife through tissue paper. "She told you she was law enforcement. She informed you her credentials were in her pocket." She explained her concealed carry status. "And instead of following basic professional courtesy or even minimal verification procedures, you physically detained a fellow officer. And every single second of your failure has been documented, not just by my official recording, but by approximately 15 civilians with smartphones. Trooper." Reese looked like she wanted the platform to open up and swallow her, finally speaking up with, "I tried to tell you to let her show her badge," attempting to distance herself from the disaster, even though her earlier silence had been its own form of complicity. Trooper Mills actually looked relieved, as if someone had finally said what his conscience had been screaming, and he immediately moved to Daniela's side, asking quietly, "Sergeant Chen, are you all right? Do you need medical attention?" Showing in that small gesture the kind of character that Paulson lacked entirely. Within 10 minutes, Platform 7 had transformed from a transportation hub into a scene of departmental reckoning. 2 additional supervisors arrived after Webb called for command staff, both of them taking one look at Daniela smoothing her jacket with shaking hands that betrayed her outward calm, one look at the crowd of witnesses still recording on their phones, one look at Paulson's pale face and defensive posture, and immediately understanding that this was a public relations nightmare with serious legal implications, and they were in damage control mode whether they wanted to be or not. Captain Jennifer Morrison, a black woman who'd broken through her own share of departmental glass ceilings and had no patience for the kind of behavior she'd just been briefed on, approached Daniela directly. "Sergeant Chen, on behalf of the Maryland State Police, I apologize for what you've just experienced. I want you to know this is being treated as a critical incident, and I'm personally ensuring that a complete investigation is conducted. I also want to make sure you're physically and emotionally okay and that you have access to whatever support or resources you need." Daniela, finding her voice again after the adrenaline started to recede and exhaustion rushed back in to fill the space, responded with more grace than most people could have mustered. "Captain, I appreciate that, but what I need isn't an apology to me. What I need is assurance that this doesn't happen to the next female officer or officer of color who doesn't happen to have a lieutenant conducting an audit nearby, because if Lieutenant Webb hadn't been here documenting this, I'd be the one facing charges right now for resisting and failure to comply, and we both know it." The truth of that statement hung in the air like smoke, undeniable and suffocating. And Morrison nodded slowly because she did know it. They all knew it. Every person of color in law enforcement knows it, that your credentials, your years of service, your dedication mean nothing if someone in power decides you don't look like you belong. And the only thing that had saved Daniela from becoming another statistic, another complaint filed and forgotten, another officer who eventually leaves the profession because the discrimination from within proves more toxic than the dangers from without, was the coincidence of being watched by someone with the authority and courage to intervene. Paulson tried one last defense. "This is all a misunderstanding. I was trained to be cautious, to verify identities. She could have just shown me her badge." But Webb, who'd been quietly compiling notes, interrupted with the coldness of someone presenting evidence. "In the 18 minutes I observed this checkpoint before Sergeant Chen arrived, you waved through 14 travelers without any questions whatsoever. 12 of them were white. One was a white woman traveling alone with a backpack twice the size of Sergeant Chen's, who you smiled at and wished a good evening. The only people you subjected to random security checks were Sergeant Chen, a young black man in a hoodie, and a Hispanic family with 3 children. So your training excuse doesn't hold water when your actions show clear discriminatory pattern recognition." Daniela Chen caught the 7:30 train that evening, an hour later than planned, but ultimately vindicated. And as she settled into her seat and watched Baltimore's lights blur past the window, she felt not triumph, but a bone-deep exhaustion that came from having to fight battles she never should have had to fight. From being seen as a threat by the very people who should have seen her as family, from knowing that her experience, while documented and validated this time, was just one incident in an ocean of similar stories that never get heard, never get recorded, never get justice. Within 3 weeks, Trooper Paulson was suspended pending the outcome of a formal investigation that would ultimately result in his termination after internal affairs uncovered a pattern of similar incidents that had been inadequately addressed through his career. Trooper Reese was placed on administrative duty pending retraining on intervention and reporting obligations. Trooper Mills was actually commended for his response once the situation was clarified. And Lieutenant Webb's audit report sparked mandatory reforms, including body camera requirements at all security checkpoints, bias training overhauls, and new protocols for officer interactions with off-duty colleagues. But here's the part of the story that haunts anyone who really thinks about it. Daniela Chen was lucky, extraordinarily lucky, because she had rank, had credentials, had a witness with authority, had a crowd with cameras, had everything working in her favor, and she still got slammed against a pillar and treated like a criminal. So what happens to people without her advantages, without her rank, without her documentation, without the coincidence of being watched by someone who could intervene? People who face the same prejudice, the same profiling, the same presumption of guilt, but don't have the armor of a badge to eventually protect them? The answer is they become statistics, they become hashtags, they become stories that never make it past local news if they make news at all. They become cautionary tales that parents of color tell their children about how to survive encounters with police. They become evidence of a system that too often protects its worst actors and punishes those who dare to speak truth about their experiences. Sergeant Daniela Chin made it home that night, hugged her daughter extra tight the next morning before the soccer game, and went back to work the following Monday because she believes in the mission of law enforcement even when individual officers fail that mission spectacularly. But she also became an advocate within the department for reform, for accountability, for creating a culture where excellence matters more than appearance, and where the oath to protect and serve applies equally to everyone regardless of what they look like or where they come from. This is Axiom USA, where we tell the stories that make people uncomfortable because comfort is the enemy of change, where we document the moments of injustice and the fights for accountability that define whether we're living up to our ideals or just performing them for an audience, where we believe that every Daniela Chen deserves better than having to prove her humanity and her credentials to colleagues who should already see her as equal. If this story challenged you, if it made you question systems you've taken for granted, if it reminded you that the uniform doesn't erase bias and that authority without accountability is just tyranny with a badge, then hit that like button, share this with someone who needs to understand what people of color face, even when they're the ones wearing the badge, and subscribe to Axiom USA because we're committed to telling these stories until the system changes, until accountability becomes standard instead of exceptional, until every officer gets the respect and dignity that Daniela had to fight for on Platform 7. One uncomfortable truth, one documented injustice, one demand for something better at a time.